If I were to say the name of a musical group, say the Easy Beats, unless you're a music enthusiast, you'd probably be, well, scratching your head as to what the heck I was talking about, or which group I was talking about. Then again, if I were to say the name of a group, say the Fab Four, aka the Beatles, even if you didn't know a thing about music, you'd know exactly who I was talking about. And that's how it kind of goes with the locomotive we're going to be discussing today, the Alco FA. It was the little brother of the PA and often not respected for what it had done for Alco. Introduced in January of 1946, it was released just short of a year before its much more popular sister, the Alco PA. And unfortunately for this locomotive, not long after its release, Alco would begin treating it like an unwanted child, and both the locomotive and the company would suffer for it. Many accused the locomotive essentially as being Alco hedging its bets, and that wasn't really far off the mark. The fact was that the RS-1 had not actually gotten to its customers and instead was sent overseas and used to serve the Allies in World War II, and it wasn't like any of that data would have actually validated what Alco was shooting for in the US, even if it was available. As you cannot compare the wilds of Siberia and the Trans-Siberian Railroad with pretty much any railroad that exists in the United States, plus the fact that the engine was in wartime service, and not basically being judged upon how efficient it was, but more for its ability, which was again only part of the story Alco needed to tell if it was going to sell the engine to its new customers that wanted both efficiency and capability. The other fact was there was still very clearly a market for a full-length cab body type locomotive or cal body type locomotive like the F series from GM, which had sold in excess of 1,000 engines. This was something Alco really did not want to ignore if it wanted to get more into diesel locomotives. And, thanks to a lot of ingenuity from Alco itself, building the second locomotive really wouldn't be all that expensive. The company would borrow a relatively new concept from the automotive industry. Take the Volkswagen Golf, for example, and its identical twin, the Volkswagen Jetta. Now, you're probably wondering how I can call these cars identical twins, as on the face of it they look completely different. Well, as it turns out, these cars are identical in every way, shape, and form except their bodies. This is a concept known in the automotive industry called platform sharing, where common components like the drivetrain, which is the engine and transmission, electronics, seats, doors, etc. are all shared and used under a series of different vehicles which can have several different bodies on them. The end result, several different cars can be made essentially for a very low price and cover several different markets because of the utilization of common parts across these vehicles. All the components from the Alco FA would come from the RS2, except the body, and well, just look at it. Beauty, ain't she? Essentially, the Alco FA was a baby PA, which shrunk down dimensions accordingly, 4 axles instead of 6, a smaller nose with the same basic standard flat across the top and sort of straight grilled face as we see here, and overall very similar but shrunk down dimensions to what the PA had. The main difference with all the Alco FA models is that they would feature more traditional number boards on the front of the engine as we see here, instead of the PA1's unique streamlined number boards. Another noticeable difference is the lack of room for a steam generator, as we see the vents go all the way to the back of the actual unit itself. This is because the FAs were not meant for passenger service. The 244 underneath the hood of the FA would originally match the horsepower output of the EMD product, cranking out 1500 horsepower with just 12 cylinders and turbocharging. Much like with its close relative, Alco also offered a booster variant of the Alco FA. This is simply referred to as the Alco FB. Essentially a cabless version of the A unit. The basic body design would essentially be a scaled down version of the Alco PA to save on costs, but this would have the added benefit of giving the locomotive the good looks of its actual larger cousin. While the concept of sharing mechanics was ingenious, the mechanics that were shared, well, weren't, to put it mildly. The infamous Alco 244 would be utilized. This prime mover was developed in haste just before the end of World War II, and was essentially rushed through every possible part of its development. The reason for the rush of development was the fact that the current prime mover the company was using, the 539, lacked horsepower output and was also a troublemaker before the more recent years where the company finally had gotten it under control and made it work correctly. It was also thought that the prime mover had run its course and didn't have much more to offer in terms of horsepower output. The final nail in the coffin was perhaps the fact that the development of the new prime mover would have been the same or less. so it made perfect sense for Alco to go with this option instead. What made little or no sense at all, however, was the fact that Alco was going to cut extreme corners in pushing the new prime mover out. Had it not learned anything from what happened with the 539? This would include, of all things, removing most of the quality testing and teardown tests that the 244 would have to go through before it went into production. This would prove a complete disaster, as serious quality control and design faults would not be exposed until it was far too late. One of the most notable cases that should have set off alarm bells was the failure of 20 Alco FAs owned by the GM&O Railroad. Their crankshafts literally split into two pieces. Unfortunately, Alco would completely dismiss the concept that its prime mover was at fault, and instead simply dismiss the whole failure of these crankshafts as being that the Rock Island Railroad was running these engines hard. Alco would respond by a band-aid approach of simply forging the replacement crankshafts and come out with a statement that despite the fact that they believed that the forging process was actually weaker, that this would solve the problem ultimately. This statement was apparently made as a way of sort of placating and backing off a lot of the customers that wanted to know why Alco didn't do this from the start, thus avoiding the problem before it actually took place. Unfortunately, the forging of the crankshafts did not solve the problem with them failing, and this issue would continue to plague the prime mover for quite some time. And the crankshaft, which is located in the bowels of the actual diesel prime movers, continued to fail left and right. In order to get it out, the locomotive would be disassembled to get access to it, and then the prime mover would need to be disassembled and essentially rebuilt to put the new crankshaft in place, which would be covered under the locomotive's warranty, which Alco would have to perform for free for all of the companies that had purchased an engine with the 244. This would be costly to the company, and eventually eat into its profits big time. The problem would finally be discovered when the prime mover got its much needed teardown, and it would prove to be the bearing saddles, which were out of round and not properly aligned. Meanwhile, the defective prime movers kept rolling off the assembly line and kept suffering the crankshaft failures. Another quality control issue that was not caught had to do with bad welding on the block itself. This would cause the main bearings to fail as they would not properly seat into the prime mover due to this. The bearings would also fail due to lack of quality control from the outside subcontractors. Again, nothing was being tested properly, so no one knew they were flawed. Alco would continue to provide updates and upgrades to the prime mover to make it more reliable. However, it seemed to do whatever it could to avoid doing a serious redesign and or a serious teardown of the engine itself to see exactly what was going on. Had it done this, it could have avoided a lot more of these issues before models like the RS3 debuted, which essentially took the company down by the head and nearly sunk it. The air-cooled turbochargers also proved to be highly unreliable. These would in turn be replaced by GE water-cooled turbochargers. By the way, a good way of illustrating the differences in the turbochargers can be seen above. Air-cooled turbochargers like this engine we're zooming in on now, which is a later production RS2, has a smokestack that goes lengthwise down the actual hood of the actual locomotive. This next locomotive is an early production RS3, so it retains the lengthwise air-cooled turbocharger. And yes, the third and final locomotive is in fact also an RS3. The reason why it has the actual water-cooled turbocharger as signified by the widthwise smokestack is that the New Haven Railroad was one of the few companies to take Alco up on its 250 engine rebuild that was not provided under warranty, as the New Haven's RS3s had aged out of the warranty by this point in time. Interesting too, the turbocharger utilized in the rebuilt locomotive was a 510 type turbocharger, as the GE water-cooled ones proved just as troublesome. It should also be noticed that many late model RS3s came with water-cooled turbochargers from the factory. The reason for my utilization of the RS3 and RS2 to illustrate the differences in the smokestacks is simply because their smokestacks are more prominent. As we see here on the FAs, they are far smaller, and in the case of most FA1s and FA2s, they were all equipped with air-cooled turbochargers, as this was the turbocharger Alco was producing when they came out. It should also be noted that some of these locomotives would receive water-cooled turbochargers later on in their lives to improve their reliability. Despite numerous failures and customer complaints on the 244 prime mover that would indicate it had serious issues that could not be fixed with the type band-aid repairs Alco was performing, the company would continue with this strategy of simply fixing things as they went wrong, instead of finally giving the prime mover a much-deserved and much-needed teardown like they should have when it was originally in its development phase. And of course, even later on after it entered production and all these issues were developing and popping up. Had Alco only taken more drastic action and taken these repair issues more seriously, it could have avoided losing so much cash on warranty repair work later on with subsequent models. This would finally be done several months later, and the 250 would be the end result of that. Unfortunately, the 250 would still appear far too late to save Alco from the impending disaster of the RS3, which incorporated the earlier versions of the 244 with their flaws and all into its design. The same misfortune would be bestowed upon the Alco FA in the form of the Alco FA2, an upgraded variation of the Alco FA1 generating about 100 more horsepower and incorporating an early version of the 244D prime mover with its air-cooled turbocharger, which was prone to failures. In addition, the FA2 would be lengthened to provide room for a steam generator, making this option available to any railroad that wanted to order it. You can see the extra length in the FA2 versus the FA1 in the shot above, as we see it occurs right behind the radiators themselves. Alco would give the passenger version of the Alco FA the FPA designation, indicating it was an FA unit set up for passenger service, indicating the gearing and steam generator were both installed for such use. The FPA option was not very popular in the United States, however, with very few railroads ordering it. That said, however, in Canada, things were different. After World War II, CN, or Canadian National, found itself in need of revitalizing its system after the long, hard war that had taken place. And that's right, you guessed it, they chose Alco, or in this case MLW, FA2s, in this case in passenger version, making them FPA2s. Unfortunately, the Canadians had the same problems with the 244 that the United States railroads had, lack of reliability, and in this case, lack of power output. The company, however, did have much greater success with the FA2 or FPA2's successor, the FPA4. Incorporating the new, much more reliable and much more powerful 251 Alco prime mover, it was able to generate 1800 horsepower instead of the 1600 of the FA2. These engines would prove very popular and reliable and stayed in service for 30 years. What finally forced these locomotives into retirement had nothing to do with reliability or age. It was rather safety concerns that were brought about by the Hinton Railway collision that occurred in Canada in 1986, when a Canadian National Freight struck VRL Canada's Supercontinental head-on. While the precise cause of the actual Hinton disaster was never determined, the underlying cause, which was crew incapacitation, was determined. Most notably the CN crew, who had failed to halt for a red signal at a passing siding. There was also no evidence that the VIA crew on the Supercontinental had tried to apply brakes when they found they were heading right for the other train. One of the end provisions that came out of this disaster in the aftermath was to require automatic train stop devices be installed on all locomotives and to make these electronically controlled, not the mechanical dead man's pedal as it was called, that had been installed previously. The dead man's pedal, as it was known as, which was the previous system utilized, could easily be disabled and was normally disabled by crews, as the pedal itself, which had to be depressed to keep the train moving, was often considered such a pain that most crews simply placed a heavy object over it to prevent it from resetting. The new system would require electronic sensors to be installed within the cab, especially on the control surfaces, to detect whether or not the crew were making active adjustments to the throttle, controls, etc. to confirm that they were in fact alert. Installing these systems in the FPA4s was considered cost prohibitive, as it would require a huge expense in installing the electronic sensors and wiring necessary to make the whole system function, and again, the FPA4s had already passed the 30-year mark in their service. They were probably close to retirement age anyway. The end result would find many of these engines sold to short lines and tourist railroads in the United States. Here they would find second lives as tourist locomotives and or short line locomotives. A good testament to the Alco 251's quality and improvements over its predecessor is that these FPA4s remain in service to this day. The Cuyahoga Scenic Railroad, as seen above, is one of those scenic railroads that took delivery of not just one, not two, but three former VIA FPA4s for its service of its line. This operation, located in the state of Ohio, at one point had four former VIA FPA4s, but the fourth unit wound up being scrapped due to mechanical issues and other such wear and tear issues that were deemed far beyond economical to repair. The company operates its scenic trains over a 26-mile former B&O main line. running from Cleveland Union Terminal all the way down to Valley Junction. The length of this railroad's line often causes it to be used as a method of transportation for people visiting the area, and indeed there are proposals to turn this particular railroad into a full-on commuter line running further into Cleveland itself. However, currently scheduling issues regarding when the scenic trains would operate and when the commuter trains would operate over the newly expanded service, as well as the utilization of some of the track in the Cleveland area the train would operate on, which is currently freight track and nowhere near up to passenger standards, are currently preventing this project from proceeding forward. In the end, Alco managed to produce 1,401 units. This spans the original production of the Alco FA1 right through to the production of the Alco FPA4. In short, the locomotive came just behind the RS3 as one of Alco's better-selling locomotives, if we count the locomotives produced at MLW. The unfortunate fact is that Alco never gave this locomotive respect beyond a certain point. The fact was that the types of locomotives being ordered by railroads, namely road switchers that could be used for both switching duties as well as road duties, were better suited for the time with the need for more efficiency and more flexibility out of fewer locomotives.
Offspring. 62G, if you can still your dispatcher there. When you went by your last sector to Flickenberg, get back to 1 Line 5 is 5 in your content.
The Alco FA was essentially Alco's unwanted child, not given the love, respect, or guidance it needed to succeed. The locomotive sent several warning signs out to its parent Alco, but the company, being the neglectful parent it was toward the engine, failed to heed these. Instead, the company would focus on its much beloved RS series of locomotives. The end result would lead Alco down a long and treacherous path that would eventually destroy it. Despite the fact that the company produced a much better prime mover, the 251, after this engine was in production, by that point it was simply too late for it to regain the reputation it had squandered. That said, all or most of this could have been avoided had Alco just taken a little more time to nurture and care for its unwanted offspring, the Alco FA. And that concludes this video. If you liked it, please hit the likes button and subscribe. If you didn't, feel free to hit the dislike button. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, keep the metal side down.